So thank you all for coming. This afternoon's lecture is sponsored by the Psychology Program, the Sustainability Program, the Stockton Center on Successful Aging, and with funding from the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I'm going without notes because I've been so involved with all the cool stuff going on earlier today, but something just clicked in telling you about the whole event. I really wanted you to perhaps give a round of applause for our colleague Zuri Kalabitseva, who's put the whole program together. She's done an extraordinary job. I've been here for 35 years, and it's been the best undergraduate psychology conference we've had in that time. So our panel today is entitled Graying Green, Climate Change for an Aging World. And we have two experts in this field who will kind of share the podium today. We're going to start with Dr. Rachel Pruchno. Rachel's been to Stockton a few times before, wearing different hats. She's the director of research at the New Jersey Institute for Successful Aging and an endowed professor of medicine at Rowan University. She runs a very extensive longitudinal study, and even you students from Intro to Psych know that collecting data over time can be really time-consuming and costly. There aren't very many studies that study people over a long period of time, and Dr. Pruchno's Orange Bowl study of older New Jersey residents is one of them. I happen to have been randomly selected as one of their 5,500 subjects, and I see from looking at her website that they'll be getting hold of me again fairly soon to find out how much trouble I have getting to class on time, getting up out of my chair, how's the arthritis, and how do I sleep. But it's a really important study, and the part we'll hear about today is what was the impact of Hurricane Sandy upon the people who lived through it who are part of her research. And if you were here for Dr. Brown's study in the morning, you heard about how her pathway to being a researcher in psychology started with a lot of data collected by some other people in Chile after a large tsunami in Chile, and how did people adjust to that and post-traumatic stress and so on and so forth. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Rachel Pruchno to come forward and share her information with us.
I'm going to talk to you about Hurricane Sandy and what happened to older people when this hurricane hit. So first, what do we know about disasters? Well, 20% of people, why are disasters important? 20% of people in the United States will experience a natural disaster in the course of their lifetimes. That's a lot of people. What we know really is based on very short-term. We know a little bit about the short-term effects. We know about mortality following a disaster. We know about PTSD following a disaster. But most of the studies that have been done so far look at just a year or maybe 2 years after the disaster. So we really don't know whether disasters have any longer-term effects. Some studies say that older people, who, when faced with disasters, are more resilient than younger people. But other research says that older people some says they're resilient, other research say that older people are more vulnerable. Some research done in 2008 with an earthquake showed that people 65 and older had a higher risk of PTSD than younger people. So there seems to be some evidence that vulnerability or resilience is really linked to pre-disaster characteristics, perhaps linked to gender or marital status or income. And the people that are at greater risk for being vulnerable to the effects of a hurricane may have some functional disability to start with or lack some psychological resources before. But the bottom line is that there's a lot that we don't know about what happens to older people in the face of a disaster. A couple of concerns and limitations of previous studies. First of all, most of the studies that have been done were based on small, convenient samples that were identified after the disaster. So it's really hard to do a disaster research because we don't know when these disasters are going to happen. So usually what happens is a disaster happens and then there's a research project that gets developed after the fact. These studies are usually cross-sectional. The time between when the disaster happens and when we can talk to people, it's all over the board. Some people can get in as quickly as within a month. That's the shortest. And then, sometimes it's up to 4 years later that we're asking people about what your experiences were like during the disaster. A big problem with disaster studies is that because we recruit people after the fact, we don't know about them before the disaster happens. And so if we don't know about them before the disaster happens, so if we're talking to somebody and they're depressed or they're experiencing anxiety, we don't know if they were like that before. They may have. Or was their depression or anxiety a function of the disaster? We don't know. And the other thing we don't know is we don't know what exposure means. What does it mean to be exposed to a hurricane or to an earthquake? Or sometimes we study people who are in a certain catchment area, but you might be in this catchment area and not be exposed. So this whole issue of what does it mean to be exposed to a disaster is sort of mucking up the science. So. Becoming a disaster researcher or a climate maven, what do you need? I didn't set out to be a disaster researcher. I was not a disaster researcher, and I'll tell you sort of how it came to be. But so to be a disaster researcher, you have to have two things. You have to have some data, and you have to have a disaster. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the data, because for me, I had some data before the disaster happened. So. Let me introduce you a little bit to the Orange Bowl study. So Orange Bowl stands for Ongoing Research on Aging in New Jersey, Bettering Opportunities for Wellness in Life. So back in 2006, we started recruiting people for this panel. In order to be eligible for the panel, people were 50 to 74. They were living in New Jersey. And they agreed, believe it or not, they agreed, they were cold called, random digit dialing. We cold called people, and we got 5,688 people, Dave is one of them, to agree to participate in an hour-long interview on the phone. And I have to tell you, when I look back at this development of this panel, when we were sort of fantasizing and thinking about how to make this happen, and somebody suggested that we do this, I said, you've got to be kidding. How are we going to get people, will people really agree to do it? And they did. What's really amazing is that, of course, we had to dial a lot of numbers and talk to a lot of people, get hung up on a lot. But this panel is pretty amazing that not only did people agree to participate in the study, but many of them have agreed to continue participating in the panel. And it really is an incredible wealth of data. So here's a little snapshot of what these people looked like when we talked to them back in 2006. And the mean age was about 61 years old. About 64% were women. You can see the marital status, about half were married and half weren't. Mean age of education is about 14 and a half years, and that's a little bit higher than the average in New Jersey, but that is typical of people that tend to want to participate in research are better educated. And about 12% of the sample was African American. The rest were mostly white. So we had this data in 2006, and the panel itself was funded, the initial panel was funded by the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, an institution that doesn't exist anymore. It was merged with Rowan University a few years ago. But so my charge, my goal in life was to keep the panel going. The idea was that we would, the institution funded the startup for this project, and then the goal was to get the NIH, the National Institute on Aging, particularly interested in this panel. So it took a while and a disaster to get the NIH interested in my panel. But in 2012, Halloween weekend, October 29th, Hurricane Sandy hit. And Hurricane Sandy hit, as you know, New Jersey and New York very hard. It was the largest Atlantic hurricane. 117 people died. There were thousands of injuries. Many homes were damaged. In addition to this hurricane, 8 million people lost power for weeks because that year there was an early snowstorm. So it was really cold and people didn't have power and they didn't have heat. $65 billion of damage. But because I had data about these people before the hurricane, in fact, we had talked with many of these people twice, at baseline and then in 2011. We had this amazing opportunity to look at the effects of the disaster on a large group of older people, right? As I said earlier, if you don't know anything about the people before the hurricane happens, and then you collect data only after, you don't know whether what you're seeing after was a function of the disaster or whether they were always that way. Well, we knew. We knew who was depressed, and we knew who was functionally disabled, and we knew who had social support and who didn't. So that we knew a lot about these people before. So what I'm going to do now is take you on a little tour of some of the findings from Orange Bowl, and we've done a lot of different kinds of analyses over the years. But I'm going to start with an early study that we did. This was a qualitative study, and I'm usually not a qualitative researcher, but we learned a lot. We identified 20 people from Orange Bowl, from this big panel of 5,688 people. We identified 20 people who experienced the most home damage. And we wanted to look at what effects did this experience have on these 16 women and 4 men. So we did qualitative interviews, sort of semi-structured interviews, and we wanted them to talk about some of the challenges that they faced. And we had them talk about some of the physical challenges, some of the social challenges, and some of the financial challenges. And here's a list of some of the physical challenges that people talked about. So they talked about power and heat loss. They talked about troubles getting in and out of their homes, cleaning up from this hurricane, the repairs, the lack of information, trouble accessing food, because many of them were trapped in their homes, flooding, disconnected phones, and health problems. And I want to give you a little bit of an example. These are some quotes from the qualitative interviews that we did. So this 58-year-old woman said, "It was so cold and so dark. We just hunkered down and stayed in our home. It was so cold, we were using anything we could find. We found sterno floating in the water. We popped the top from the sterno and warmed our fingers over that." Cleanup. The tree came from the 2nd floor down to the 1st floor bathroom the night of the storm. I went to the bathroom. I couldn't open the light. There was water dripping out of the light fixture, so I had a lot of damage. I had to fix the ceilings, and I had to clean the rug upstairs dry. Up all the water in the rug, and downstairs it was a mess. This was a 69-year-old woman. And to give you some idea of some of the health issues, now some of these people had health problems before the storm, and these were exacerbated as a function of the storm. Here's one example. This is a quote from a 73-year-old man. "My wife started going downhill, I guess, depression. It affected her. She's had a shunt because she had water in the brain at one time. So we thought maybe that wasn't working right or whatever. We called an ambulance, and we took her to the hospital to test, and everything, and all the tests showed the shunt was working okay, and possibly she had a stroke or something, and nobody really gave me an answer. We were afraid something might happen to her. She wasn't walking steady, and it continued. It was just getting worse. She fell down and she hit her head on the wall. They did all kinds of CAT scans and this and that, and nobody have yet to this minute turned around and told me, whatever it is. They were all agreeing to brain damage. I attributed it to that damn storm." And of course, as you can imagine, there were emotional challenges. People were distressed, they were surprised, they were worried, they felt powerless. And as you would expect, there were financial challenges. So older people, just like younger people, experience financial challenges as a function of the storm. For many of these older people, it was a real challenge because they were living on fixed incomes. So there were the damages and negotiating fixing things on a fixed income. There were foregone vacations. Many didn't have insurance, and many worried about selling their home. So we looked at what kind of support did these people get from their families and friends. And we found that families, you know, when crisis happens, families are usually there and friends are usually there. And we found in these interviews that people talked about getting physical support from families. They had a place to stay. They were checking in with family, and they were getting reassurance from their families. But what we heard that we didn't expect to hear was the incredible role that neighbors played. So families were important, but even the physical support that neighbors provided, they're much greater type of tasks. Neighbors provided a place to stay. They checked in on these older people. They helped them clean up. They shared food. They shared their home. They visited. And there was a lot of socio-emotional support that were provided by neighbors. And sometimes these people really didn't know their neighbors before, but something about this crisis brought the neighbors together, the neighbors and the older people together. So here's a few comments. So one 71-year-old woman said, you know, neighbors were nice to each other, I do have to say. Young people, all helpful. Somebody really needed help, they helped each other. So that was a good thing. Another woman said, more friendly because we spent a lot of time outside just talking about the storm. But yeah, it did bring us closer. A 66-year-old woman said, everybody was very helpful. If they saw you struggling with appliances or carpet, people would stop and help you. And another woman said, with my neighborhood, like everybody, it didn't matter. If you knew anybody, you would walk and talk to someone on the street and say, are you okay? Because nobody was okay. So interestingly, though, over time, that incredible neighborliness that pulled people together dissipated over time. As the storm, cleanup happened, people went back to their lives, and the closeness that had brought people together, that necessity, sort of dispersed, and people got back to routine. So one woman said, we were extremely tight. We were all out in the street together. When my husband got hurt, they were all right there supportive of me. We were always friendly anyways, but we were even more so directly after the storm. Now that people have rebuilt and are moving back in, the people that came back, I'd say, went back to how it was before. In another analysis, we had the opportunity to do something very interesting. Because we had this large panel, we were able to identify one of the variables that we measured after the storm was PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And although very few people experienced what could be thought of as clinical PTSD, there were 44 people out of this whole big Orange Bowl data set who profiled as having PTSD after Hurricane Sandy. So what we were able to do, because we had this big sample, is we were able to match these people. We matched with people who did not experience PTSD. So we matched them on gender, on storm exposure, and on geography, where they were living. We worked with a geographer, and we plotted where each of these 44 people were living, and then we matched them with, each person was matched with a gender exposure and geography-based pair. What we found here is that 6 years before the storm, we were able to identify characteristics of people who did and people who did not develop PTSD after the storm. So 6 years before Sandy, people who developed PTSD were poorer, they had less positive affect, they were in poorer health, they had less social support, they were not working, they were more depressed and had more negative affect, they had more functional disabilities and chronic health problems and more pain. So what's interesting about these analyses is that, when the next disaster strikes, it tells us that these are the people that we really need to worry about, and we really need to make sure that these people are supported. To be able to know 6 years before that this would happen, I mean, these characteristics are identifiable before a disaster strikes. in another set of analyses, we looked at successful aging. And here what we did was we assessed these 5,688 people multiple times. We followed them, many of them, 4 times over 9 years. And what we found was that over time, subjective and objective successful aging, and what that is, subjective successful aging is we ask people to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 their success, the extent to which they have been aging successfully. The objective indicators of successful aging were illnesses and pain and functional disabilities. So over time, for the whole sample, the average person in the sample, both objective and subjective successful aging declined. Okay? But the people who were exposed to Hurricane Sandy experienced sharper declines in both subjective and objective successful aging. So this hurricane had a dramatic long-term effect on the way these people aged. And in a recent analysis, we were really interested in, so what is it about exposure? What kind of exposure is really critical to, in this case, predicting depression 5 years after the storm? And we looked at 4 different kinds of exposure. We looked at people who were living in the FEMA counties that were most hard hit. Okay, that was one definition of exposure. A second one was this peri-trauma stress. So we asked people how, did they feel an immediate danger during the storm? Did they feel distressed during the storm? Then we asked about personal and property loss, personal injury and home damage, and friends or family killed or harmed by the storm. And then we asked about post-storm hardships. So because of Hurricane Sandy, did you stop working? Did you have to leave your home? Was your home moldy? Did you lose income? And we were really looking at what effects each of these exposures had on depression. And we were sort of charting depression over a 5-year period of time. So what's interesting is that we found that each one of these exposures had an independent effect on depression. So the more exposure, the more depressed. But when we put all of these exposures together, the exposure variable that had the most significant effect on depression was the peri-trauma stress. It was in the moment feeling distressed or that they were in immediate danger of the storm. So that tells us a lot about, if we sort of think about, okay, when the next storm happens, the people that we need to worry about are the people who are feeling threatened in the moment of the storm. And some of the other research has shown that, we need to sort of, that exposure is personal or property loss or some of the hardships that come afterwards. But what we found was that it was the experience in the moment that causes people to be depressed. And I think that you would expect short term, but I was just really surprised to see that these exposure variables had such long-term effects. And we're actually have found that similar findings for functional disability. And there too, it's this peri-trauma stress that predicts functional disability 5 years later. So really powerful effects of this natural disaster. So what have we learned? Some, but not all, older people exposed to a disaster experience long-term effects. We learned about the importance of neighbors, and we learned that the type of exposure matters, and that it's really important to measure exposure in this more fine-grained manner.